I believe that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States. And anyone who asks someone else to put them over the Constitution should never be President of the United States again.
The grift from this family is breathtaking. It's breathtaking. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Kushner walk out of the White House and months later get $2 billion from the Saudis. $2 billion from the Saudis. You think it's because he's some kind of investing genius? Or do you think it's because he was sitting next to the President of the United States for 4 years doing favors for the Saudis? That's your money. That's your money he stole and gave it to his family. You know what that makes us? A banana republic. That's what it makes us.
So in just the last 24 hours, 3 new candidates have joined officially the Republican primary. Last night, it was former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. Today, it was former Vice President Mike Pence, as well as North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. In all, there are now 10 candidates running for the nomination, and that tracks the 2016 race, when exactly 10 candidates had announced by this point, not including Donald Trump, who did not announce until mid-June. Of course, that field eventually blew up to 17 candidates by the fall. Oh, George Pataki. I actually forgot that until I looked at that graphic. There are a lot of differences between that race and this one. For one thing, I think there's an increasing belief that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis might be a bit overhyped, but he is pulling in 25-30% in polls. And of course, there's an enormous, obvious frontrunner, right? Donald Trump, who's leading the field, and between the two of them, they're drawing 70% of voters. But on top of that, there's the potential for Donald Trump to face yet another indictment, possibly more. Sarah Longwell is a publisher of The Bulwark, host of the Focus Group podcast, and she joins me now. First, I want to start with this point about the logic of entering the race. You've got polling. Here's the latest Republican primary poll. So you've got Trump at 56 and DeSantis at 22. It's still very early, but that's super different than 2015, right? This, 78% of voters clustered around these two candidates. My thinking is that the general thinking of everyone else is DeSantis really ain't all that, and Lord knows what's going to happen to Donald Trump. Is that how you see it?
I guess. I think it's different for different people. I think there are some of them that are running for maybe vice president more than they are president. I think there are people who are in it for the name ID. I did not know who the governor of North Dakota was, and now I do. So he's already doing something there. You've got Vivek Ramaswamy, somebody I had never heard of. And Chris Christie, I think, is getting in really to try to go hard at Trump because he thinks that there's a market to do that. So I think there's a variety of reasons for people getting in. I think for Mike Pence, he thinks God really wants him to be president. I think he always thought he would be president.
He also really wants to be president.
He really wants to be president.
He and God agree on that.
That's right. Unfortunately, who doesn't agree is the voters. I'm not sure there is anybody that we talk to in the focus groups who are more savage, who they are more savage to than Mike Pence.
I want to talk about that because my former colleague Benji Sarlin, who's now at Semaphore, made a point today, which I thought was interesting. He said, look, on paper, just on paper, if you say, I love Trump, I'm a conservative Republican, I like Trump, everything but the January 6th stuff, that was too much. And maybe like the tweeting. On paper, that's the Pence pitch, right? Like Trump minus the country's first coup is basically the Pence pitch. And yet that doesn't, that's on paper, but in reality, that doesn't seem to be selling.
Yeah, here's the problem for Mike Pence. He is in the sour spot with voters. Either the people who really love Trump think that he is a traitor. They, wish him ill. And then there's the crowd that just thinks he's boring. Or thinks he's a nice guy, but sort of doesn't have a political future. The thing that's happened in our politics is people really crave now a certain combative style that Mike Pence, to his credit, does not have. And I think it's evidence of the dysfunction of the Republican Party that there is no chance that Mike Pence could win a Republican primary.
Yeah, I was just saying Republican primary voters, I think, just to specify. I know you meant that, but because I think the general voter is actually way less into the combative shtick. And honestly, I think there's a case to be made that a sort of non-combative and more boring candidate might actually perform better in a general election. I don't know, but I think there's certainly a case for that. But the desire, the thirst for blood combat on the primary folks in your focus group people is pretty clear, right?
It's super clear. And look, you take a guy like Tim Scott. I think Tim Scott would be a phenomenal general election candidate. I think that he would do really well with swing voters. I think the chances of his sort of optimistic pitch getting out of a Republican primary is really slim. Sunny optimism is not where the voters have been. And a lot of that is because Trump, again, has sort of trained people to feel sort of in a constant state of grievance, a constant state of anger. And so, really what people are looking for when they say they want somebody besides Trump is they say Trump without the baggage. That is the phrase I always hear. And that has been sort of the DeSantis pitch. And I think there's a reason why the vast majority of the party wants one of those two people. And I'll just add one thing. For a lot of these candidates who ran in the pre-Trump era, ran in the last back in 2016, the voters have a real sense of sort of the before times candidates, the people who were there before Trump, and they think of them as establishment. They have no interest in them. I can't tell you what it means to be kind of a before times establishment candidate. That is just not what Republican primary voters want.
I wish I could tell my 24-year-old self how central America as a hellhole will be to the messaging in the American right in the year 2023. Bizarre. Sarah Longwell, thank you very much.
Thank you.